Young Charlotte lived on a mountainside in a wild and lonely spot. There were no dwellings for miles around except her father's cot. 'Twas on a many a wintry night young swains would gather there, for her father kept a social board, and she was very fair. These are the opening lines of a poem published in 1843 entitled A Corpse Going to a Ball. The poem, written by Seba Smith of Maine, had a few inspirations that are spooky, sad, and even as innocent as a child's toy. On New Year's Eve, as the sun went down, far looked her wistful eye, when out through the foggy window pane the merry sleighs dashed by. In a village 15 miles away was to be a ball that night, and though the air was piercing cold, her heart was warm and light. One inspiration for this tragic poem comes from a source of joy for young children in the early 1800s, in the form of a small porcelain doll. These dolls, though the paint has faded over time, would have been presented with snow-white skin, red lips, and painted black hair. They were molded in a solid figure without joints and appeared stiff, almost as if in a state of sleep, or as some would state, death. Oftentimes, the toys were embedded in soap and could be extracted through use. They were made hollow and could float in water, making them a fun bath time toy. Another method of presentation was to bake the dolls into cakes and other desserts so that the figures could be revealed through dividing up the cake among the family. The children would then be given the doll, much to their delight. How brightly beamed her laughing eye as a well-known voice she heard, and dashing up to the cottage gate, her lover's sleigh appeared. "O daughter dear," her mother cried, "this blanket round you fold, for it is a dreadful night abroad, you'll catch your death of cold." "Oh nay, young Charlotte cried, she laughed like a gypsy queen. "To ride in blankets muffled up, I never could be seen. My silken cloak is quite enough, you know 'tis lined throughout, and there's my silken scarf to twine my head and neck around." Another piece of this origin comes through a newspaper article that was observed by its creator, Seba Smith. The story told of a young woman who had died on her way to a ball when she froze to death in the carriage. This story inspired Smith to write the long and devastating poem of a similar tale. Her bonnet and her gloves were on. She jumped into the sleigh. The lovers flew down the mountainside and over the hills away. Through muffled beat so silently, 5 miles at length were passed, till Charles, with few and shivering words, the silence broke at last. "Such a dreadful night I never saw, my reins I scarce can hold." Young Charlotte faintly then replied, "I am exceeding cold." He cracked his whip, he urged his steed much faster than before, and thus 5 other dreary mile in silence was passed o'er. Said Charles, "How fast the freezing ice is gathering on my brow." Young Charlotte then more faintly said, "I'm growing warmer now." The poem was well received by audiences, and was even put to music in later years. When the dolls first became available in America, there was an immediate connection made with the poem, as people began to associate the imagery of the frozen appearance of the tiny figures with that of the young frozen woman on her way to the ball that she would never reach. Thus on the road flew the lovers fair, through the blistering cold starlight, until at last the village lamps and a ballroom came in sight. They reached the gate, and Charles sprang out and held his hand to her. "Why sit you like a monument that hath no power to stir?" He called her once, he called her twice, she answered not a word. He asked her for her hand again, but still she never stirred. The final lines of the poem, of course, reveal the dark truth of the long and dreadful sleigh ride. Young Charlotte has died from the cold of the night. The poem was received as a warning against the dangers of vanity, and in a time long before heated vehicles, a lesson about listening to the wisdom of parents knowing what is best for their children. He took her hand in his, 'twas cold and hard as any stone. He tore the mantle from her face, and the cold stars o'er it shone. Then quickly to the lighted hall her lifeless form he bore. Young Charlotte's eyes was closed for e'er, her voice was heard no more. As well as the frozen Charlotte dolls, a more male form was also created, and was dubbed by the name of Frozen Charles. As the poem ends, Charles was overcome with grief at the loss of his true love. He dies from the sorrow, and the lovers are buried together forever. And there he sat down by her side, the bitter tears did flow. He cried, "My own, my charming bride, you never more shall know." He twined his arms around her neck and kissed her marble brow, and his thoughts flew back to when she said, "I'm growing warmer now." They put the corpse into the sleigh and hurried it back home. And when they reached the cottage gate, oh, how the parents moaned. The parents moaned for their daughter dear, young Charles wept o'er the gloom. He wept until he died of grief, now they both lie in one tomb. Today, a tradition of baking dolls into cakes is still practiced once a year during Mardi Gras. However, the tiny figures are now presented in a smaller plastic form. The original dolls varied in size from a few inches to some over a foot long. These dolls and the poem now remain as a reminder of the joys of childhood, as well as the spooky tragedy associated with a once beloved toy.